Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to kind of jump into what's going on in Syria
Okay.
after the fall of President Assad. And,
Mm.
a lot of people might assume that it's a pretty simple, good guys win situation. But our source material, which
Yeah.
is a BBC News video titled, Syria Sees Outbreaks of Violence and Killings, um, tells a very different story
Oh, wow.
and a much more troubling story. And it's really not that straightforward. So
Yeah.
get ready, because what we're going to uncover is a really complex
Yeah.
web of conflict and violence, even after Assad's removal from power.
Huh. I mean, that's really surprising to me. I think a lot of people would assume that,
Yeah,
with Assad out of the picture, things would kind of settle down.
yeah.
But clearly that's not the case. So what's going on?
Yeah, and I think what's really striking from the outset of this report is that the new authorities
Right.
are really struggling to maintain control, especially in areas that are predominantly inhabited by Alawites,
Right.
which is Assad's own sect. And I mean, this power vacuum that's been created has really opened the door to a new wave of conflict. And it's a stark contrast, I think, to the peace that a lot of people were hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, it's tragic that even after the regime change, the violence hasn't stopped, and it seems like it's even spiraling in some ways.
Yeah, and to really bring this home, the BBC report takes us to an Alawite village that actually suffered a really brutal attack.
Oh, wow.
And they spoke with a family who lost their 20-year-old son, Habib, in this attack. And this really stood out to me because I think it illustrates that the violence that's occurring isn't simply about,
Right.
who supported Assad and who didn't.
You're right. It kind of shatters that oversimplified narrative.
Exactly.
That it was just Assad's supporters versus everyone else. Because this family that they interviewed, they made it very clear that they didn't support Assad,
Right.
but they were still targeted just because of their sect, which, I mean, it's really disturbing. It exposes, I think, a much deeper
Yeah.
and unsettling reality of what's happening on the ground in Syria.
Yeah. And Habib's father actually said something in the report that is bone-chilling.
Okay.
He says, "We are Alawites, and the previous president was also Alawite. But we didn't like him because he was a bad person and he wasn't worth it being a president. But the ones who came after are meaner and crueler."
Wow. I mean, that's just heartbreaking. You can really hear the despair and the disillusionment in his
Yeah,
voice.
it's palpable. And the BBC report goes on to paint an even more kind of haunting picture. Um, they describe an olive grove in this village, and an olive grove, generally symbolizes peace and life.
Right.
But now it's been turned into a makeshift cemetery.
Oh, God.
It's a really grim reminder of the human cost of this conflict.
It's a really powerful image. I mean, to see something that's usually associated with life,
Yeah.
now being a place of death, it speaks volumes about the situation there.
And as if that wasn't devastating enough, this cycle of violence continues.
Mm-hmm.
So government forces retaliated, and this led to yet another massacre, this time targeting government security officers.
Oh, no.
And from the report, it looks like these officers were executed.
I mean, this is just insane. How can there be any hope for peace when you have this kind of back and forth violence?
Right. And it really raises the question, can the new government truly control all of these different factions that are now vying for power?
Right.
And their ability to protect all citizens, not just a specific sect, is really hanging in the balance here.
That's a good point. I mean, can they actually govern effectively and protect everyone, or are they just going to end up being another oppressive force?
Exactly. And one of the officers they interviewed, a guy named Saber, actually provides some insight into just how chaotic the situation really is. And he basically explains that while they try to unify Syria, there was a lot of anger from people that were still loyal to Assad's regime.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that there would be some pushback from people who benefited from the previous regime.
Right.
But to resort to violence like this, it just shows how deep those divisions run.
Yeah, and he's very open about how difficult it is to control all of these different groups, especially with foreign fighters now entering the scene.
Right. The foreign fighters just add another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation.
Right, they're really throwing fuel on the fire.
Exactly. And that makes it even more difficult to even imagine how they're going to achieve any kind of stability or peace in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, the report really paints a stark picture of the fear and destruction that have become everyday realities for people in Syria, burned homes, deserted neighborhoods. It's just heartbreaking.
And it's easy to forget about the human cost when we're talking about these larger political issues.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that behind all the political complexities, there are real people whose lives have been completely shattered by years of conflict.
Yeah. For example, one family, the Jafars, they had to escape from their burning home. They lost everything.
Oh, God, that's awful.
And the father simply says in the report, "I don't want anything, just my soul. And the soul of my children, we've got nothing to do with anything."
I mean, that just breaks your heart to hear that level of despair.
Yeah, it really personalizes the tragedy of the situation. And, amidst all of this despair, there's a glimmer of hope that the report highlights.
Oh, really?
They interview a young boy, and despite losing everything, he still expresses a desire to stay in Syria and study. And
Wow.
he says, there's no future, but I have to stay here.
That's incredible. I mean, to have that kind of resilience in the face of such hardship, it's truly inspiring.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, what does the future hold for him and for Syria as a whole?
Yeah.
Because it's very clear that, overthrowing Assad was just the beginning,
Right.
and the path ahead is anything but easy.
Yeah, it definitely feels like the situation is far from resolved, and there are a lot of challenges still to come.
So we're looking at a very volatile and dangerous situation. And with that in mind, what does this mean for the new government? I mean, what are some of the biggest challenges that they're facing right now?
Well, I think the challenges are huge.
Yeah.
I mean, first and foremost, they need to establish control over all of these different defense forces and factions that are operating within the country.
Right.
I mean, without doing that, preventing further violence and protecting all citizens, regardless of their background, it's practically impossible.
Yeah, it sounds like a monumental task.
Yeah.
I mean, ensuring the safety and security of all Syrians, regardless of their beliefs, is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
But how do they even begin to approach that in this current environment?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, they need to somehow create a government that is genuinely inclusive and represents the diverse interests of all Syrians.
Okay.
And let's not forget about the threat of extremist ideologies, which, often thrive in chaos, and preventing their spread is another battle altogether.
Absolutely. And speaking of pathways forward, the BBC report mentions that there's an upcoming EU conference
Oh,
in support of Syria. Could this be a turning point?
well, it's definitely significant. I mean, this is the first time that Syria will be represented at this conference since Assad's fall,
Oh.
and the focus is going to be on providing much-needed aid to the country.
Okay.
But there's a crucial caveat here.
I'm all ears.
Donor countries are understandably cautious. They want to see concrete evidence that this new government is genuinely committed to inclusivity, particularly when it comes to minorities and women's rights.
I see.
They need reassurances before they're willing to commit to these large-scale aid packages.
So it's not just about writing a check.
Exactly.
It's about ensuring that the new government is truly building a more just and equitable society.
Precisely. There's a sense of cautious optimism, but also a healthy dose of skepticism the world is watching very closely to see how this new government is going to navigate these incredibly complex challenges.
This is obviously a lot to unpack, and we've really only just scratched the surface. But we're going to delve deeper into the implications for Syria's future in the next part of our deep dive. But before we do, I want to pause and get your initial thoughts. What stands out to you so far from this report?
I think what really strikes me is, just the sheer scale of the challenges facing Syria. I mean, where do you even begin to address all these interconnected issues?
It does feel incredibly daunting. I mean, how can they possibly break this cycle of violence and start to rebuild,
Right.
their country?
Yeah, I think a crucial starting point has to be accountability. I mean, those responsible for the massacres and the atrocities,
Yeah.
regardless of their affiliation, need to be brought to justice.
Right.
It's fundamental not just for the victims and their families, but for establishing a sense of law and order. It sends a powerful message that, these acts will not be tolerated.
That makes sense. But
Right.
with so much chaos and so many factions acting with impunity, how do you even begin to hold anyone accountable?
It's a monumental challenge for sure, no doubt, but it's not impossible. International organizations like the UN
Okay.
can play a key role in investigating these crimes and gathering evidence.
So that evidence can then be used to pressure the new government to
Exactly.
take action regardless of who's involved.
Precisely. It's not just about punishment. It's about creating a system where justice prevails.
Okay, accountability is clearly crucial. What else needs to happen?
Well, we need to talk about disarmament. I mean, the sheer volume of weapons circulating in Syria is just a major driver of the violence.
Yeah, and the BBC report really highlighted how even many civilians have access to weapons now,
Exactly.
which adds to the volatility.
Yeah, so a comprehensive disarmament program is essential. It won't be easy.
Right.
It requires cooperation from all sides, but it's a crucial step towards creating a more secure environment.
Okay, so accountability and disarmament. But we can't forget about the humanitarian crisis.
Huh.
I mean, the report really paints a grim picture of the conditions that people are enduring.
Yeah, the humanitarian situation is dire. Millions of Syrians have been displaced both internally and externally
Wow.
and are living in desperate conditions.
Yeah. And with the economy in ruins, access to basics like food, water, and healthcare is incredibly limited.
Yes, absolutely. Providing humanitarian aid is an urgent priority, and that involves ensuring safe passage for aid organizations and tackling the root causes of the crisis, like poverty and the lack of infrastructure.
And this is where the EU conference could be a real game changer, wouldn't you say?
It has that potential if donor countries are convinced that the new government is genuinely committed to inclusivity and reform.
Right.
They'll be more likely to provide the financial assistance that's desperately needed.
So it sounds like a lot hinges on this conference.
It's a pivotal moment. It's an opportunity for the new government to demonstrate their commitment to a better future for their people.
And for the international community to show their support for the Syrian people who have endured so much suffering.
Absolutely. But we have to remember that this is a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
Rebuilding Syria both physically and socially requires time, effort, and sustained commitment from all stakeholders.
So we've talked about accountability, disarmament, and humanitarian aid. Let's kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about the political landscape, what needs to happen to create a more stable and inclusive political system in Syria.
The million-dollar question. Well, the BBC report mentioned that the new government is expected to announce a transitional government soon. And this will be a key indicator of their commitment to inclusivity and representation.
So the composition of this transitional government will be under intense scrutiny?
Without a doubt, donor countries, as well as the Syrian people themselves, will be watching very closely to see if it truly reflects the diversity of Syrian society.
Okay.
Does it include representatives from all sects and political backgrounds? That's the litmus test.
And what if it doesn't? What are the implications there?
Well, that's a worrying scenario. A transitional government that's seen as dominated by one group or faction
Right.
could further destabilize the situation and lead to more conflict, and it would likely undermine international support as well.
So the stakes are incredibly high.
The formation of this transitional government is a critical step towards a more democratic and inclusive Syria, but it's just one step on a long and challenging journey.
Seems like there are no easy answers here.
That's the reality, but recognizing the complexity is the first step towards finding lasting solutions.
We've covered a lot of ground, but let's bring it back to our listener for a moment.
Yeah.
What are the key takeaways here for someone trying to understand the situation in Syria?
I think the most important takeaway is the situation in Syria is far more nuanced and complex than it appears at first glance. The overthrow of Assad didn't magically usher in peace and democracy.
Right?
It created a whole new set of challenges and conflicts.
It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and the major political developments, but we can't lose sight of the human cost.
Exactly.
These are real people whose lives have been shattered by years of conflict.
And while there are no easy solutions, understanding the complexity is key to supporting meaningful change.
So what's next? Where do we go from here in our deep dive? So we've talked about, the internal challenges facing Syria, but I'm curious about the role of the international community. What can other countries do to really support peace and stability there?
Well, the international community has a significant role to play. They have a responsibility, I think, to support the Syrian people in their pursuit of a better future. And this can range from, providing humanitarian aid to actively pursuing diplomatic solutions.
Okay, let's break that down a little bit. What more can be done on the humanitarian front?
Well, as we discussed, getting aid to those in need is absolutely critical, and this means working with trusted organizations on the ground and putting pressure on all parties involved to ensure safe and unhindered access to conflict zones.
Right, so it's not just about pledging aid, it's about making sure it actually reaches the people who need it most.
Exactly. And beyond that immediate relief, we need to be thinking long term, supporting sustainable development initiatives, rebuilding infrastructure, investing in education and healthcare. All of these things are essential for a more resilient and prosperous Syria.
So it's about addressing those urgent needs while also laying the foundation for a brighter future. What about diplomacy? What role can the international community play there?
Diplomacy is key. The international community can facilitate dialogue and negotiations between the various factions within Syria.
Because ultimately, there's no military solution to this conflict.
You're absolutely right. A lasting peace can only be achieved through dialogue and compromise, and external actors can help to create the conditions for these conversations to occur. Acting as mediators, providing guarantees, encouraging all sides to come to the negotiating table in good faith.
So it's about using diplomacy to kind of nudge the different groups towards a shared vision for the future of Syria.
Precisely. And that vision must prioritize inclusivity, human rights, and the rule of law.
Let's be realistic, though. Given the deep divisions and mistrust, do you think genuine reconciliation is even possible in Syria?
That's the question that keeps me up at night, honestly. It's a long and difficult process, especially after such a brutal conflict, and it demands a willingness from all sides to confront the past, acknowledge wrongdoing, and commit to a future that's built on mutual respect and understanding.
That sounds like a monumental task.
Yeah, it is. But I believe it's possible. We've seen instances of reconciliation in other post-conflict societies where seemingly impossible divides were bridged through dialogue, truth-telling, and a shared commitment to peace.
So there's hope, but it requires a tremendous amount of effort and a genuine desire for peace from all sides.
Absolutely, and that's where the Syrian people themselves come in. Ultimately, they are the ones who will determine the future of their country.
And this brings us back to your thought-provoking question from earlier. What does real peace and justice look like in a country that's been ravaged by years of conflict?
It's a question that each Syrian must grapple with, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer. But in my view, a truly just and lasting peace must be founded on accountability, inclusivity, and respect for human rights.
And it needs to address the root causes of the conflict to prevent history from repeating itself.
Exactly. It's about breaking the cycle of violence and building a society where all Syrians feel safe, respected, and empowered to shape their own destiny.
That's a powerful vision. It's certainly a vision worth striving for.
It is, and it's a vision that requires the collective effort of the Syrian people, the international community, and all of us who believe in a more peaceful and just world.
This has been a really insightful exploration. We've delved into, the harrowing realities of the ongoing violence, the complex challenges of rebuilding a shattered nation, and the crucial role of the international community.
And we've contemplated what a just and lasting peace might look like in Syria. It's a complex situation with no easy answers, but understanding the complexities is the first step towards finding solutions.
To our listeners, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic. Seek out diverse perspectives, stay informed about the evolving situation, and consider how you can contribute to supporting peace and justice in Syria.
Remember, even small actions can make a difference by engaging with these complex issues. We create a more informed and compassionate world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning and keep exploring.